Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Nelson George is the most accomplished critic of African American music of his generation, the Washington Post book world once affirmed, adding the important note that his connection with hip hop from its infancy has provided him with access to many of its most notable icons. And as a music critic, that this author grew up reading from the mid 1980s on as he ascended to music editor at Record World magazine. George kept his ear to the street week in and out as a columnist for the Village Voice and his finger on the pulse of everything hip happening in music as one of Billboard's editors over the 1980s. He'd see his first New York Times bestseller when he became an overnight household name with music fans in 1983 with the release of the Michael Jackson Story, which sold millions of copies, enabling George to expand his creative resume to include that of film producer when he helped finance Oscar winner Spike Lee's first film, She's Gotta Have It, in 1986, with Lee vouching as a career-long fan that I've known Nelson over 30 years, and he has been our cultural storyteller for that length of time. Keep telling, keep writing our stories. I know that I'll keep reading them too. His next two bestsellers, Where Did Our Love Go? The Rise and Fall of the Motown Sound, and The Death of Rhythm and Blues, would follow as his next two published titles, and have stood the test of time such that nearly a quarter century later, Newsweek, in reviewing Thriller, George's next biography on Michael Jackson following the pop legend's passing, noted that like most of George's work, Thriller weaves quickly between its subject and its author, an approach that works seamlessly in his previous works, The Death of Rhythm and Blues and Hip Hop America. The latter title would inspire Kirkus Reviews to compliment the way veteran journalist expands his view of hip-hop far beyond artists and discs. He looks also at such related phenomena as graffiti, cinema, and commercial culture. George would go on in the 1990s to expand his filmmaking resume to include co-writing Chris Rock's hit parody CB4 and his work on The Chris Rock Show, even as he continued to add to his library of published books with new nonfiction hits like Elevating the Game, Black Men in Basketball, Buppies, B-Boys, Baps, and Bohos, Notes on Post-Soul Black Culture, Blackface, Reflections on African Americans in the Movies, Post-Soul Nation, the explosive, contradictory, triumphant, and tragic 1980s as experienced by African Americans, and The James Brown Reader, 50 years of writing about the godfather of soul, and The Hippest Trip in America, Soul Train and the Evolution of Culture and Style, along with a very unique literary project, the Nelson George Mixtape, Volume 1. The author has displayed equal gifts in the fiction noveling realm with releases like Seduced, One Woman Short, Show and Tell, Nightwork, a novel, and the Dhunter mystery series featuring the plot against hip-hop, a novel, The Lost Treasures of R&B, The Accidental Hunter, which PopMatters.com promised was a real page-turner, and The Darkest Hearts, where Mystery Scene magazine observed that George's passion for and encyclopedic knowledge of hip-hop suffuses every word of this smart, stylish novel. Nelson's memoir, City Kid, a writer's memoir of ghetto life and post-soul success, has been crowned by Chris Rock as perhaps one of the 7 greatest books ever written. It has the realness of the autobiography of Malcolm X, the warmth of The Color Purple, and the page count of Tuesdays with Morrie. It's a must-read. While legendary Public Enemy founder and frontman Chuck D vouched that there are few people who can put the past 70 years of urban reality into the perspective of the most recent hit minute like Nelson George. He served as executive producer of VH1's Hip Hop Honors and BET's American Gangster series, and he joins us today to talk about his wildly successful career as a music journalist, author, television and film writer, and producer, including acting as supervising producer and writer of the hit Netflix series The Get Down, and upcoming documentaries A Great Day in Hip Hop Revisited and Dear Mama, a Tupac documentary airing on FX. And he's here today to talk about his truly one-of-a-kind career with words. Nelson, welcome to the show. The Los Angeles Times once wrote that stories of your childhood are funny and downright arresting, talking of your spiritual alignment with Captain America or the pluses and pitfalls of embracing the symbolism of the 1968 message movie Planet of the Apes. You see all the seeds of a media critic being planted. What were any of your favorite and most influential storytelling mediums as you first discovered and absorbed music, TV, books, and film growing up?
Well, my mother was a big movie buff, and also big. She used to have parties in the house, so I had both music and cinema. I would say, she loved she loved Sidney Poitier, and she loved Alfred Hitchcock. So I remember as a kid, and James Bond. So I remember seeing Goldfinger as a little boy. I was maybe 8 because she couldn't get a babysitter or something. And I remember those movies. I remember Goldfinger and Thunderball really, really vividly as a kid. I also saw the film Marley, Hitchcock movie with her because she was like it was her Saturday afternoon ritual. So those are my real introductions to, like, I think, for stories. and then just music was a big part of her life. She used to give parties on Saturday night. What I do remember that were the 45s, and I remember picking up and looking at the names of the songwriters, and I never forget that Motown 45s had a little star, red star for, I guess, for Detroit. So I was like, "What's Detroit?" And I remember the same thing kind of was the Stax records. It would say, I think it was the Memphis group or something like that. It would say Memphis, Tennessee. So, I had, what are these magical places that this music comes from? So I think those are things that I both remember. My mother also, um, she taught me how to read pretty early on. It's interesting. I really was an advanced reader.
How old were you when you first began thinking about doing any writing of your own?
Um, Hemingway really impressed me, particularly the Nick Adams stories. And when I was about 14 or 15, they used to have that what was it called? Literary Guild, where you could order these books and they would come once a month. And I saw there was a special offer. If you sent $1 in, you could get uh 3 or 4 Hemingway novels, you could get 4 Fitzgerald novels, you could get both Tom Wolfe books, and you could get Faulkner. So I said, "Oh, this is a great cheat. I can get a lot of books for $1." And so the the Gatsby really, really captivated me as a teenager. And out of the Hemingway, I actually ended up becoming really connected to the Nick Adams stories. And the Nick Adams stories seem like, oh, they're simple. They're about a kid growing up in Michigan. Maybe I could write stories about a kid growing up in Brooklyn. So the Nick Adams stories were probably my gateway into really writing. And then I think the most significant book for me in terms of music were 2 books. And I guess I read them around the same age. Um, Real Marcus's Mystery Train and Leroy Jones's Blues People. Um, and they really opened my mind to music as a topic and as a literary topic, and these connections about, in Jones's case, Black history in America and a relationship to racism. And then Marcus also, his Elvis chapter is very famous from that book. He did a fantastic chapter on Sly in that book. And also, that's how I got turned on to Robert Johnson. So those books then led me to get the records. And so it's sort of uh, they were like educational texts for me. So both as a writer, but also just in, okay, what does this sound like? I've read these descriptions. What is this like? So they were very. I think those are foundational books for me, and then also the Hemingways.
While you were attending St. John's University, when did you begin doing any writing in the musical or critical realm?
There used to be before the internet. They used to have these weekly publications that told you where to go and what to do. And there was a magazine in New York called Q, and Professor Wolf, I think it was Professor William Wolf. He was a movie critic at Q magazine, and we would go to the city, and he would get us into screenings as a class, and then we would kind of write reviews of the films. And that was really, really. First, I met a real writer, right, and then he was a critic, which was an interesting job. And out of that connection, I began, reading the Village Voice and reading New York Magazine and getting more interested in what critics did. The other person I should shout out is Alan Seeger, and he was a professor who did a class on foreign films. Now, what was important about that is through his class, again, like what was William Wolf, I was learning about history. I was learning about the history of historical criticism, I guess you might say. So he showed Seven Samurai. No, he showed Yojimbo. He showed Yojimbo by Kurosawa. And then I started reading about how people wrote about that classic film. What else did we see in that class? we saw. I think probably saw my first Fellini movie in this class, and um, so there was this interesting thing where we would see the film, read the text, and then begin going on and writing our own essays. I think one thing I really remember is um, I wrote a essay called uh, "Black Musical as Genre," which was because I think I was able he may have I saw Cat from the Sky, which was a musical from the 40s. Then I saw it somehow, I think through MoMA. MoMA used to have this thing where when you were a kid or anybody, you could go in and you could screen vintage movies in a room at MoMA. And so I saw, I think, Green Pastures from the 30s at MoMA. Um, and sort of connected to this is I had a history of jazz class as well, which is important. I forget the professor's name, but I remember talking to him about the lyrics of Sly Stone and saying that maybe these were great lyrics, and he poo-pawed Sly. Uh, but I do the history of jazz class was also very useful. Again, I think when I look back at the St. John's years in terms of what I got at school was these three of all the things I took there. These three classes, working with a real music and film critic, getting a historical look at film history, and having a history of jazz all combined together to give me to open me up to all these different sounds and different texts.
As the Washington Post Book World once wrote in a cover story on the launch of your career, Nelson George was a neophyte music critic, interning for Harlem's Amsterdam News when he covered his first rap concert in 1978. An obscure music writer looking for the next big thing that could help propel him into the critical limelight, George had his ear tuned to the sonic rumblings emerging from the South Bronx. How did you first get your foot in the door working for Amsterdam News and then Billboard? And please talk about how you became a street reporter on the front lines, reviewing and covering the rise of hip hop as it first began doing so in the late 70s and dawn of the 1980s.
It was the Am News internship was a cultural experience. I was from Brooklyn, and a Brooklyn kid. I didn't really go to Harlem. Harlem was I went to the Apollo a few, as a child. My mother took me to shows, and I still went to shows, but it wasn't a place I hung out. So going to Harlem was all the history of Harlem was very important. Learning about all these different people who lived there. Also, that Harlem was um, a place which I did this hip hop thing is starting to happen. So not that it's hip hop, it's just this thing that's got disco. Everything's disco basically when I'm in college. Um, and then sometime during that time, I saw a kid walk by. I was on 125th Street in front of a Blimpies, and a kid walked by with a boombox, and someone's rapping over it. And I said, "Yo, what's up? Who's that? Who's that?" And he's like, "DJ Hollywood. Act like you know." Like, and he kept going. Like, I'm a square. I don't know who DJ Hollywood is. But that was my first real introduction to just a boombox walking by with somebody talking a rhyme, of course, and that really intrigued me. And then I saw a flyer for a show at City College of New York, and it was an R&B show. I think Evelyn Champagne King was on the show and a few people, but Hollywood and this guy Lubbock Starsky were the entertainment or host. And so I went to the show, and Hollywood was a rapper. He's he's the first MC I saw, one of the early SMCs. Lubbock Starsky, who DJ'd, also could rap. And I don't, the R&B show was whatever, but the entertainment value and charisma and throw your hands in the air and wave it like you just don't care. So many things that became standards by the 80s. These guys were doing. This is like 77, 78. So part of this whole narrative is also then that I became an intern at Billboard magazine. And I'm going to say 78, 70, 77, or 78. And I was kind of like the mascot of Billboard. Send a kid who wants to do heavy metal, review heavy, nobody, send a kid. Who wants to review disco? Send a kid. So I did a lot of I saw AC/DC at the Garden with opening for Ted Nugent. But I also saw, Sylvester and First Choice at a gay disco in the West Village. So it was a real great crash course in music. And music I probably wouldn't have been introduced to, otherwise. So I met this guy, Robert Ford, Rocky, he did reviews for the magazine. He also worked in the production department. And I became kind of his mentee, and we became really best friends. And he was also very interested in this thing that was happening, and he went, I think I was with him this day. We went to the place called Downstairs Records, which was a record store in the subway station at 6th Avenue and 42nd Street. It was really famous because they had a lot of cutout records, which was, you get 19 cents, 1.99, 2.99 records. And he was told that these kids were coming down from the Bronx and buying like 50 cutout records. And like, what's going on here? So there was a flyer for this show in the park. So on a Saturday afternoon, we took the D train up to the Bronx, got off by Yankee Stadium, walked across the Grand Concourse, and found a high school. I think it might be Taft High School. I have to check, but Taft High School. And there's kids already kind of hanging out, and chilling, and so something's about to happen. So we're waiting. A van pulls up. A bunch of guys get out with like crates of records and milk crates, which is how everything was shipped. A basic kind of 2 card tables they laid out, and they unscrewed the base of the light pole and plugged in this electrical cord into their speakers. And this guy was Cool Herc. And it was amazing because I interviewed Herc that day. And what he was doing, what he called B beats, basically, break records or records for the boys who break, I guess. And so it was in a schoolyard, and it was a thing. Now I'd seen schoolyard DJs in New York. They'd been around, the disco era. But what he was playing was very different from what I was on the radio, the kind of breakbeat, the kind of records he was playing. And that became Rocky did an article for Billboard, and I did an article for Amsterdam News about this phenomenon. And so that was my first, I'd probably done some other music stuff, but that's my first real, doing something unknown and pitching it and getting someone to buy it. I know they held it for a couple of weeks and then it ran. And it's one of the first articles on hip hop. But it all came out of the same environment, of being uptown, and then also having a mentor who could sort of guide me and also say, Nelson, this is unusual. We should go follow this up. This is not what's going on at Studio 54. There was a general reluctance on the part of Black adults to give this any credence. I know at the Amsterdam News, I did that early piece. And then we had a new editor come in the entertainment section, who was very good actually overall, but he, like a lot of Black adults, poo-pooed this. It's not real, it's a fad, it's not real music. And so I remember trying to get him to publish other stories, and he wasn't that interested. And that was the general attitude throughout people think that hip hop exploded. Hip hop came up, it didn't explode. It was I would say the entire 80s is this long journey to acceptance. From radio, from record companies, from media, TV media, in all aspects. It's a minority music, a cult music that just continues to grow, right? So I remember that very vividly, the reluctance of a lot of my older peers. People I respected to want to pay attention to this. And the other is the connection between joy and violence. When I say that, I would say from those early shows at City College I went to, and at clubs all the way into probably the early 90s, there was always a fight, a robbery, of something happened at a hip hop show. It just did. At that show I went to back in 78 at the with Hollywood and Starsky, there was a big fight in the middle and the chairs are flying, and blah, blah, blah. But the thing about that, what I never forget, is that once the fight had subsided and whoever had been doing the stuff had been thrown out, people went right back to the party. They were not going to give up the party because some guy showed his ass. And that happened over and over. I remember going to, there was a big show. I'm thinking this is probably 81 or 82 at the Armory in Harlem Armory. And I'd been to enough hip hop. I had a woman at the Village Voice who came with me, who I was kind of trying to get with, and a friend of hers. And I had already been to enough hip hop shows to say, let's sit in the balcony. No, let's not go on the floor. And sure enough, there were like 2 or 3 fights or things, and basically some guy pulled a gun, and the thing ended in chaos. And I never forget that because the woman was very, very grateful to me, very grateful, and I thought, oh, this is worked out, so I was a little bit of a hero that day for her. And that was like, wow, this hip hop thing, this idea of the joy, and also like she could jump off. And that was all the way true up until 89. I remember going to, I helped start the Stop the Violence movement thing with, with Ann Carly at Jive and KRS-One. And that was inspired by being at the Nassau Coliseum and seeing, again, I think a kid got stabbed at one of those shows. But that was pretty much that was pretty consistent, that there would be teenage anger or there would be an actual larceny at any hip hop show you went to. So you had to be prepared. I always tell people, whenever I went to a club back then for a club show, if it was a stand-up show where you could stand up, I would stand with my back to the wall, on my back against a pole, so that no one could come behind me. And I also would always there's this thing that a lot of New York guys do, is they take their jacket and you kind of put it over your side, kind of over your shoulders like this. So it's not, you're not too hot, but if you have to throw it on and go, you're ready to go. So those are 2 very strong memories of that era.
Who are any of the most promising up-and-coming stars that you crossed paths with back when they were still a part of that underground scene? Maybe even helping give them some of the first press that they received for their music and print.
New York.
Well, Curtis Blow I was very involved. So this guy, Robert Ford Rocky, who helps me kind of discover hip hop, he looks around and says, wow, this is really unusual. Maybe there's something I can do with this. And he and a partner at his, JB Moore at Billboard, get the idea to make a Christmas song with rap. And the idea is that Christmas songs are always evergreen. So cut to, I become roommates with Robert Ford. We have an apartment in Queens. And so I'm around the whole process of making Christmas rapping. I meet this young Russell Simmons, who's Curtis's roommate, not roommate, he's classmate at City College, who's this young promoter guy. Christmas rapping is very successful, to the surprise of a lot of people. And that was a record that was rejected by almost every Black person in the music business. It was a white British new wave guy who signed it to Mercury. So they do the breaks. And the breaks, they recorded actually, so I meet young, he was kind of called Son of Curtis Blow, which was Run during this time, and Russell's little brother. So they start hanging out at the studio. All these records were recorded at Green Street Studio in Soho, when Soho was was not like a shopping district. It was an arts district at best. There were galleries. It was kind of dark down there, but they had a studio. So I remember the session for the breaks very, very well, because Rocky decided to have party people in the back. So there's a whole group of people, party people in the back. If you're not the whack, don't stop the body rock. And so Curtis is doing the stuff, and we're like chanting and singing along. And I can hear my voice pop out a couple of times in the mix of that. So Curtis Blow was the big bang because of a few things. Curtis A is the first artist signed to a major label. His signing gives Russell Simmons a platform, and Russell begins seeing how he's already giving concerts and like parties around town. Now he's looking at management and how to make records. He meets his brother he meets a guy named Larry Smith, and Larry helps write. Curtis was rapping in the breaks, and Larry becomes Russell's musical partner. And then there's Run, and we meet Run and Jay and DMC. And so out of that community, they begin making the Run DMC records. Everyone thinks that Rick Rubin came much later. It's really Larry Smith is the backbone of what made Run. He was the musician that Russell knew. So Russell had ideas, but Larry executed them. So out of that initial sort of Curtis Blow record thing, this whole kind of thing begins to blossom out. And then Larry goes on to produce all the Houdini records. So and then Russell starts, Rush Management, and that becomes a big deal, and then it ultimately leads to Def Jam. So out of that initial meeting between, and this is a great story. This is how the whole thing started. Rocky's walking down Jamaica Avenue. Back in the day when now it's an underground subway. Back then it was an elevated subway. So you had poles, just like you're saying about flyers. Rocky sees a little kid putting up a flyer for a party, a Curtis Blow party. The little kid is Joseph Simmons. Like he's helping his brother do shows, and he also was like Curtis's initial DJ, and they called him Son of Curtis Blow. So out of that initial meeting, mushrooms this whole community that becomes a very significant wing of hip hop.
We'd say so, and the world met them all a few years later, including myself as a wide-eyed and eared kid in the mid-1980s, when Crush Groove hit movie theaters and HBO, as Run DMC were just becoming the kings of rock, while you in 1983 got the call that any young music journalist on the rise would jump at, to write the book on the king of pop, the Michael Jackson story, which would in turn put you on the map as a New York Times best-selling author for the first time. I owned a copy of this little book when I was 8 years old and first getting excited at all about reading, like so many other kids in the 1980s. Taking us all back in time, did this start out as an idea you approached a publisher with? Or were you sitting at your desk one day when the call came in randomly, like they sometimes can to music journalists?
And just as you depicted, I was sitting at the office. Now, the thing is, I'd already been covered. I was, at this time, starting in, I worked at Record World from 81 to 82. And then in spring 82, then they went out of business, and I started at Billboard. And I was at Billboard by March or April 82, and I was there until 89. So I've already been covering the Michael Jackson thing pretty, intensively. I remember seeing the previous Jackson's tour, played the Garden, I think in 80 or 81. And the reason so I was around that thing. I also had met I'd met Quincy by then. I interviewed Quincy Jones extensively. Did a couple of big interviews with him. So I was sort of like covering it on the ground as it was starting to happen, from Off the Wall through the Jackson's album through. And you could see something was happening but who knew it would be that big. And then I got a phone call at Billboard, which is, we're looking for an author to do this book. It needs to be delivered. But it was like, I'm going to say this was the spring, and it had to be done in like 4 months or something. It was a pretty, in order to get it out for January 84. And so, as you said, these kind of books had become a staple. I think that Dave Marsh's Springsteen book, Born to Run, was a big bang. It did really well and made the Times bestseller list. And now there's like a glut of these books. Good work for young writers, right? So, so I said, how much is it? They'll pay you $7,000. $7,000 in 1983, was it? Yeah, 1983 is a lot of money for a guy who's making $300 a week, at Billboard. So I said, sure. I wasn't sure if I could, I'd never done a book. I wasn't sure, but I knew that this is an opportunity I couldn't turn down. And I wasn't the first choice, by the way. There was someone else another writer already turned it down. So it was Dell Publishing. I think the editor's name was Gary Luke or Gary Luck. And I had to suddenly grind, hit the pavement. Luckily, I'd already interviewed a lot of those guys. So I'd interviewed Quincy, I'd interviewed Greg Fillinganes. I interviewed almost a lot of the musicians I already had interviewed. And then I lucked into a few people. who knew Michael well, his family. I only spoke to Michael one time, and this is a funny story. I'd gone to LA and I was interviewing Joe Jackson, who, the patriarch of the family. At that point, he still managed Janet. I think Latoya was going to make a record. He still managed Michael along with a couple of other guys. And I'm talking to Joe, and Joe's a very boisterous, kind of braggadocio type of guy. A lot of people didn't like Joe. I found him amusing. He didn't, make me mad. Some people didn't like him, but he kind of I found him entertaining. And he puts Michael on the phone. I guess to prove his. I think at that point there were a lot of rumors about Michael and him having trouble, and that Michael wanting more control, which he eventually got. He puts me on the phone with Michael Jackson. So I talked with about 15 minutes with Michael, which is weird. And also there was definitely interesting power dynamic between Michael and his father. Why would you just do that? You're proving a point, you know. But that was lucky for me. I got that. So all of these things started happening, and I was able to get the book done. Now, what's interesting about the manuscript itself is that literally to make the final deadline, I went on Saturday to Dell Publishing. It was me, a woman who was working as a publicist for me, and Gary, the editor. And I had to that was interesting. The book had a lot more rock critic stuff in it. It was more like a Village Voice article. And Gary and I were knocking heads over how literary critic, how critical is it, or how is it digging, And so he had me rewrite certain sections he thought was too complicated for the readership. And so literally, I was on a Saturday, and I spent like an entire Saturday in their offices. I was there early, and I remember leaving late, rewriting stuff to make the deadline for the book. So it was a grind. Oh, it's not here. I have somewhere a copy of the New York Times when it made it to number 3. I think I have it lacquered. Remember you used to put that stuff on the wood and you lacquer it. I think I have that, because that was an amazing. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's just life-changing.
Worth it though, I bet. Not only did it put you on the map as a New York Times bestseller, but made your words golden with readers like me as fans, who really first got excited about reading through reading about music with this book. And you really began to build a bold catalog as the 80s rolled on. Next with Where Did Our Love Go?, the rise and fall of the Motown sound, which the Detroit Free Press complimented as leagues beyond other volumes written about Motown. Was this a natural extension of the research you'd done into writing the Michael Jackson book that inspired you to want to next put your own spin on the most famous label in R&B history up to that point, and many people still argue today?
The Michael Jackson gig, I really wanted to write about Motown. I was fascinated by Berry Gordy. I was fascinated about how that worked. How does this Black company out of Detroit become a global brand? How does this Black company out of Detroit create at least 4 or 5 huge enduring stars? I mean, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Michael Jackson. These are they're still, they resonate in the culture still. So I was really fascinated by it. And so part of the Michael Jackson book is I already started interviewing people about Motown. So that actually ended up helping each other. But having the book, then it definitely helped me get the deal to do the Motown book. Absolutely. The two things are linked. But also, the Michael Jackson money allowed me to get my own apartment. So I had been living with Robert Ford in Queens, Rocky, up until, when did I move out? 85. And now I had the wherewithal, to get my own place. And I moved back to Brooklyn. I moved to Fort Greene, Brooklyn. And it was an area that had beautiful housing stock, but was considered crime ridden. So there was this incredible brownstone. I mean, that was empty. There were a lot of empty brownstones in the mid 80s in these parts of Brooklyn. So I was able to get a duplex with a fireplace, wood floors, had a backyard. It was amazing. I mean, I couldn't believe it. But I only could afford it because of the Michael Jackson book. And so that gave me the wherewithal to do, I could stretch out. I had my own place. I was also able to then afford to hire, to go do research, get researchers. I remember going to Detroit and spending an entire, maybe a couple of days in Detroit at the county records office, and finding every lawsuit that had ever been on Motown, because I figured there's a lot of detail in there. And it was an amazing. I found an amazing amount of detail about the company from the transcripts of the testimony for depositions. Um, so yeah, that Michael Jackson book facilitated a change in my life that then allowed me to go ahead and have more wherewithal to be a better writer, and and do the research that I needed to do, and then be able to take on Motown, and to write about, interview Marvin Gaye. The musicians were the backbone of that book. Earl Van Dyke, band leader, piano player, James Jamerson, who was then not in great health, but genius. Um, God, so many people. Everybody who's seen that documentary about Standing Styles of Motown, I talked to, kind of Johnny Griffin and Uriel Jones, and just these amazing musicians who were the backbone of Motown. Going to Detroit and hanging out with these guys. A lot of them were doing play. They would do like weekly gigs at local jazz clubs, so you could see the Motown stars, with the musicians, jamming, playing, Blue Note type records. Who's the vibe player? I'm total blank. But a guy named Beans Bowles, who was a saxophone player, but also was part of the management company at Motown. These guys treated me with such respect, and also uh, gave so much of their time. And for me, they were the keys, because um, the stars are a lot of the stars, Smokey's not gonna tell you anything out of school. He's gonna tell you the party line. Um, Marvin is a lot more eccentric. You got Marvin obviously gave you some nice stuff. Um, but those musicians were really the people who really, really made that book possible.
You get into the movie business next almost as a happy accident when you helped a neighbor of yours, a then unknown film director-writer, Spike Lee, finance the production of his first film, She's Gotta Have It. And he's in more recent times referred to you in print as my brother, Nelson George. Was that a case where you were looking for a cool creative place to park some of your Michael Jackson book royalties?
Before I even moved to Fort Greene, I had met Spike because there was a girl who knew me and knew Spike, and Spike wanted to do music videos. I'd seen Joe's Bed-Stuy Barbershop, We Cut Heads, his award-winning student film. I saw him like Channel 13, PBS. So I was aware of kind of this guy. And then he did a video, on his own. He did a video for White Lines, the Melly Mel song, with Larry Fishburne, or Lawrence Fishburne, in it, on spec. He made it on his own. And he really wanted to get into the legitimate game. So that's how our first meetings were really about. I remember introducing him to some people at different record companies. He just couldn't get a gig, unfortunately. But then so that's like in 85. Then 84, 85. Then I moved to Brooklyn. I ended up moving around the corner from Spike. And he invites me over to his house. He lives in this small studio in the bad part of the neighborhood. And he's got this thing, She's Gotta Have It. And I loved it. It was amazing. I'd never seen anything. It just was a kind of unprecedented look at Black sexuality and Black life. And I said, okay, I have money from Michael Jackson. So I invested, I think, $3,500, which, again, it's a 1980, mid-80s money. That's probably 20 to 25,000 now, maybe. And I just really believed in this piece. I introduced him to other people, trying to get them to invest. And it just became, he became it. People got it. Island Films picked it up, which, again, a music connection. That Island Films was a subsidiary of Island Records by Chris Blackwell. And it becomes this phenomenal thing. I remember it opened on 66th and Broadway at a cinema there. And walking up the first opening day, and there's a line around the block to see this film. And it was a film. The audience was mostly, incredibly, almost entirely 20 something, maybe 30 something young Black people. Like this, so it felt more like a coming of age thing. It wasn't just a record, a movie. It was a thing that was touching something. And I mean, one of the best parties I've ever been to was at the Puck Building on Lafayette and Houston, the after party for the premiere. And you know, Fab Five Freddy is there, and the Knicks are there, and it just was this thing, and it was a definite feeling of our generation coming of age, or coming into our own. And so when I talk about the shift, that was that movie, because it just opened up a whole world of possibilities, you know, for so many people. For me, I never, I mean, I'd want to be involved in film a bit, but I was busy, you know, and now this said, it seems possible. It seems possible. A guy from around the corner just made a film that's in theaters. Fucking sick. And so that was one of the big bangs of the era for me.
Newsweek complimented within your next nonfiction music study, The Death of Rhythm and Blues. That is a work George has uncovered a lot of fresh information, not just on the artists themselves, but on the booking agents, arrangers, and record men. What led you to want to document this pivotal change the genre was going through in the 1980s so poignantly in real time?
What happened is that the culture was changing profoundly, and I could see it happening from the music that I loved. I was already feeling by 85, 86 that I'd missed it. That you know, the Earth and the Fire, peak of Earth and the Fire, or the peak of Parliament Funkadelic, all that great 70s music that I loved was being changed. The technology was changing the way it sounded. The businesses were changing how music was marketed. And I felt a little bit like, oh man, I missed the golden era. And I was at a convention in I think I was in New Orleans or Philadelphia, one or the other, a Black music convention. And sort of parallel to the musicians in Motown were these record business veterans who were like promotion guys. Jack the Rapper Gibson, Joe Medlin, there was a woman named Joyce you know, these people who'd been around the game forever. And it took a liking to me because I was curious. One of the things that sort of made my career is that I love sitting down with the veterans and just listening to them talk. And I would learn not just the records, but the culture behind the records. And the people who weren't famous, who had made the guy who gets such and such a record on the radio when they didn't want it played, or you know, the people who were behind the scenes of the culture. And so they talked to me about a thing called the Harvard Report. I'm like, what is that? So essentially I would say around, it must have been like 68, 69, 70, someone at Columbia Records went to the Harvard Business School and commissioned a report on the Black music business. And basically, it became it outlines all the things that were happening, how major labels were buying up independent Black labels, how major labels were siphoning off talent from both Black radio and from record companies to bring them in-house, how they were able to pay more money and give better royalty rates to emerging stars. Basically how because what I saw happen with it went from an independent business with Motown or Spring Records, the little labels, you know, all platinum, to like everybody being signed to CBS, Warner Brothers, Polygram, which was both good and bad. The good part of it was they paid better royalties. The payments were better. There was less tricky accounting. The bad part is that there was a certain kind of homogenization that came with that, as the labels wanted certain kinds of music to cross over. And there was a lot more choices being made outside the culture about how stuff got marketed. Because I mean, the R&B world was a world of I would say of African Americans and ethnic groups, largely a lot of them Jewish, some Italian. That was the R&B world. So the people you'd meet were, um, older Southern black guys who did move to the big city, or like guys like Spring Records, which was a label of Millie Jackson that was owned by Julie Rifkin and I forgot his partner, Julie Rifkin and his, but these guys were kind of tinted shade at night guys, and it become a much more corporate business, and a little more conservative, a little more. I mean, everyone you'd go to these gatherings, and everyone was, had American Express, corporate American Express cards, which changes how everything moves once you have more money. So I saw this change going, and to me, what was interesting about the idea of the Deaf Rhythm Blues was not just the music. It was the fact that radio had changed, the fact that content promotion had changed, it was the fact that retail had changed. And these are, when people think about music, they tend to focus on the artist and then perhaps the means of distribution. But there's a network of relationships that constitute any, as you know, any cultural scene. And those are all being shared. And a lot of the older veteran black folks and white as well, who are in that world were moaning. They could see the world shifting, the culture shifting. And so that became my point of focus, is it wasn't just interviewing artists, it was, interviewing radio guys. I did a history of black radios in the book. There's a history of black retail in the book. There's a history of black content promotion in the book. So out of the Motown book, some of those relationships, actually just some even to go back to the Michael Jackson book, I'm able to really now delve into the culture and the means of production, if you will, of R&B music, black music, pop music.
Your catalog grew more eclectic from there with your next release, Elevating the Game, Black Men in Basketball, where Publishers Weekly raved in their review that the thesis of George's, black players have remade basketball, becoming the very soul of the game, came vividly to life in this notable history of the role of African Americans on the court. He shows that as early as the 1920s, Marquise Haynes revolutionized dribbling as skill. And in the vividly titled Buppies, B-Boys, Baps, and Bohos, Notes on Post-Soul Black Culture, where they added that Village Voice columnist George has already established his scholarly depth and his gift for stylish, finger-on-the-pulse reporting on black music. This collection marks him also as a knowledgeable, entertaining critic of African-American pop culture generally and its pervasive influence on American life, and vividly illustrate George's sensitivity to the social complexities of African-American life. What did it mean to you, looking back, to be a voice in the cultural conversation of the time people listened to as one that perhaps opened some eyes and some ears? Such an important generation, and the reverberation of that influence forever after to follow.
I think the hardest thing is trying to get a grip on culture when it's shifting before your eyes. What are the important people? Who are the important players? Trying to, okay, who should I be focused on? So I had that feeling at one point, that I'd missed the Black Power movement. I'd missed the blaxploitation movies. I felt like a lot of the things that made me want to be a writer about music and culture, I'd missed some of the things I would have loved to have done, have been around. And then I began reflecting on, and being around the transition that was happening. So I knew Russell Simmons before Def Jam. And like, I can see by the late 80s, this thing has become a powerhouse. When I moved to Fort Greene, I moved around the corner from this guy, Spike Lee. Wow, that's happening. I can see and his impact on that. And there were so many, as time evolved, I began seeing people who are my peers now. Like, I'm no longer the guy interviewing just older people. Now, these are my friends or people that I'm aware of who we might end up at the same house party or, going to the same Knick game or whatever. That this thing there was an evolution happening that I was actually part of, as opposed to reporting on. And that was deep. Like, oh, this is going on, and I need to be paying attention to all of these different elements. And these elements are intertwined, they're interacting with each other. So Mike Tyson has a fight on the street in front of a place in Harlem, And that fight turned out to be Dapper Dan's, where Dapper Dan is making these clothes at night. Dapper Dan's making these clothes at night. And in fact, that there are artists who go from the Apollo. Literally, there was a couple of stories of a rapper playing the Apollo who, in between shows, went to Dapper Dan to get a new outfit. So you go from Mike Tyson to Dapper Dan back to the hip hop and the Apollo. And then, then a lot of the people who were going to Dapper Dan's were drug dealers. And that leads you into what's going on with crack and how that thing is affecting the culture. And so all these things are kind of threaded together. I used to say that particularly by, I would say 87, 88, 89, in that era, you could go to a party in Manhattan and the famous drug dealer, legendary scary guy is there, 2 or 3 amazing emerging rappers, the hottest chicks in New York, the hottest girl who's in every music video. There's a designer who's designing clothes for that girl, and he might be a gay guy who's designing clothes for her. And then, and all these models are there. So and then there's like, the Knicks are there and Patrick Ewing is hanging out. So within these spaces, there's all these different elements of culture. And they're not, sometimes when we write about, a lot of times we write about culture as if these things are the spirit, that spirit, they're in different boxes. But they're not different boxes. They're all interacting with each other, sometimes very intimately, sometimes, change, but there's a connection. And so that became my, that collision or that merging, it maybe is a better word, is what really inspired both those books.
You were expanding your filmmaking catalog by now into the early 1990s with a flurry of successes across the stylistic spectrum, including co-writing an early Halle Berry star's Strictly Business, and then really blowing up in this world when you co-wrote and co-produced CB4 with future comic superstar Chris Rock, at the time a star on SNL, and perhaps best known on the silver screen as Pookie in New Jack City, and featured cameos in this movie from everyone from Ice Cube to Eazy-E to Ice-T, Flavor Flav, and even Shaquille O'Neal. How did you and Chris first team up to collaborate here? Was this an idea he brought to you as a concept?
This month is the 30th anniversary. I think, yeah, we came out in oh God, that's weird. That's crazy. I'm living now in Fort Greene, and there's a woman I know who, again, it's always just interesting because women were sort of conduits. Goes, I have a friend, a guy, comedian, it's Chris Rock, and he wants to write a script. I was aware of Chris. I met him in passing at a couple of parties, but I didn't really know him. So he came over to my house in Fort Greene, and I said, what do you got? And he had very little. The name, Cell Block 4. He had the name of a couple of the characters. And he had actually some of the bricks are straight out of Low Cash. What wasn't straight, it wasn't Low Cash yet. It was just, I forgot what the name was then, but he had basically a parody of Straight Out of Compton. And I said, well, like, he seemed promising, but like, I was really busy. I still have at that point, I'm working on Strictly Business at that point. I'm working on a couple of books. I'm still writing for The Voice. So like, I don't have time to just do something if some guy's not, ready. So I wrote out a bunch of questions. If you can answer these questions, I'll help you. But I figured he's going to go away. Because one thing you learn, and you might have gone through this, people always ask you they want to write a book and and you tell them, well, you need to do this, that for me. You get it, they're gone. They're not coming back. They're not going to do the work. Chris did the work. He came back with a much more developed version of the script and much more developed version of the idea. So okay. And we sat down, I never think we sat down and watched The Ruddles. Have you ever seen The Ruddles? Yeah. It's one of the only collaborations between the Saturday Night Live, Not Ready for Prime Time Players, and Monty Python guys. So it's
yeah. I have seen a little bit of this. Yes.
So that was what we watched. We watched Kentucky Fried Movie. We watched a few like heightened comedies, if they had music, Blues Brothers, and began like sketching out, okay, what is this thing? And And then Chris, was on the road a lot as a young comedian doing gigs. So my girlfriend at the time, actually, neither one of us had a computer at that point at our house. So my girlfriend at the time would type up these different drafts of the script. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happened with that project. But I think the most important though is that, so I'm sitting at home and I get a phone call from Brian Grazer, who is like, the big producer of Imagine Films. Like, holy shit, it's Brian Grazer calling me. Somewhere on the grapevine, he's heard that Chris and I have this script. And, he's interested in doing something in the hip hop space. And so that sort of took us to another level. And we worked on it. I mean, here's a little tidbit. Ben Stiller was the original director of CB4. Ben was we had meetings at the Mondrian Hotel. I'll never forget it. It's me, Chris, Ben Stiller, and a guy named Bob Locash. And Bob is a comedy writer who's part of the Zucker Brothers family. So we sat in a hotel room in LA for a long time working on this thing. Then Ben gets his own TV show, The Ben Stiller Show. And that starts his, journey. But yeah, Ben was going to be which would have been crazy and interesting, if that would have been a whole different direction for his career, to say the least. But yeah, man, so that was a really, funny. And also for me and Chris, the idea of CB4, we said, what is this film about? And ultimately we use the phrase, the stupidity of hardness. That there was a cartoon wrestling, almost WWF wrestling type vibe to a lot of the gangster rap stuff. And the way it was being received, by the way, was so heightened and out of control relative to it actually, the seriousness of what it was. So that really is the driving force behind the movie, is that we kind of saw the funniness. And for me, it was also like a way to, it's sort of an extension of my music criticism, because in a way it's a film of criticism in a way, mixed in with really stupid jokes.
You'd then take your first official dive into published fiction with Urban Romance, and then Seduced in the mid-1990s, which the Los Angeles Review of Books, like many readers, rooted on as a smart, funny, and wonderfully resonant novel. It's the 1980s, and aspiring songwriter Derek Harper is a man easily seduced. Not only do the big three, money, fame, and women, keep him running, but Harper falls prey to subtler forms of seduction as well. The ease of rationalizing bad behavior, abdicating responsibility, and keeping the whole world at arm's length. All these scenes are brilliantly interwoven with a behind-the-scenes look at the music industry, particularly the evolution of rap. What was the transition like here, fictionalizing a business you'd written about factually for so many years, and with a romance in the backdrop to boot?
I did a series it really starts with the book Urban Romance. And then Seduce was an extension. I think that was the sequel, I think. Yeah, I mean, the Urban Romance was basically, I really liked the work of Terry McMillan, who'd already started really emerging as a force in commercial sort of Black fiction. And I thought, is there a way to... Also, I had two love affairs that were very impactful on me, that had a big impact on me emotionally. And so I wanted to write about a Black love story, but I also wanted to keep it in the world that I knew. So the guy's basically me as a young music journalist. And actually, Urban Romance is there's a lot of stuff in there that is very biographical of my career as a young music. And that book did really well, actually. It was a bestseller on the Essence charts. It was very well received. And so I got a chance to do the sequel, and I wanted to write a full-on music sort of roman à clef. So that, if you read that book, that where the lead character lives in that book is my old apartment in Brooklyn. And there's a character in there, Edgecombe Lennox, who basically is all of these old guys, that from the Motown guys to the promotion guys, who really took me under their wing. It's very, it's very autobiographical in the sense that both the books are, and that the music stuff in there is really, really the real stuff. I mean, it's real people I met. Um, and I was also interested in the idea of the one-hit wonder, because back in the even to the 90s, you still had these reviews that would travel around the country, and there'd be like 10 acts on the bill, and maybe they'd had 2 hits. Right? Those Dick Clark kind of review things. So I was really fascinated what it was like to be a person who has all that success and then it goes away. Because by now, I'd met so many musicians and singers who'd had a hit, a big one, but they're gone. And, so I was really fascinated with, well, how do you deal with that? And, what's your mentality like? So I thought that was a good character to try and base a story on. And it's a guy who has success after struggling for years, but he's not taken seriously as an artist and has to figure out his life after that. So that was a big motivation for me to do that.
Essence magazine called Nightwork unabashedly fun. Is it safe to say you were having some yourself writing in fiction as a break from the sheer research that goes into writing a nonfiction work?
Beginning to get more and more into noir, I'd always have been a fan of Chinatown, the film. One of the most memorable experiences of my young life, seeing that in the theater. I loved Hammett. I loved Chandler. I love noir. I love the continental op stories. And so I began, so this guy is kind of Nightwork is a sort of a male gigolo. It's kind of like a noir-esque character who's living in the dark side and gets involved in a murder investigation. And so I was increasingly drawn to those kinds of things. And to this day, as you probably know, I've been writing. That was in a way the beginning of me going away from war love stories into to noir and crime stories as a genre.
That is definitely the case, especially with the arrival of the Dhunter Mystery Series, which kicked off with the NAACP Image Award and Literature finalist A Plot Against Hip Hop, a novel, hailed as a welcome nostalgic trip by the Chicago Tribune, while shelf awareness promised readers that the wonderful sing-song street slang dialogue and esoteric industry knowledge make the Lost Treasures of R&B a richly entertaining addition to George's evolving series, and Pop Matters celebrated The Accidental Hunter as a gritty mystery set against the backdrop of New York's hip-hop music culture. A real page-turner. While the Library Journal celebrated To Funk and Die in LA as a work where critic and journalist George knows the streets, and his work has a gritty feel that'll hold readers' attentions. Name-dropping of 1970s and 1980s performers such as the Daz Band, Shalimar, and Shaka Khan add spice to this well-crafted story. And Mystery Scene magazine argued within the pages of Darkest Hearts that although the author deftly deals with issues of predatory capitalism, government corruption, and the senseless murder of black men, it's his handling of the tale's sex trafficking and Me Too subplots that deserve special acclaim. What did you find most thrilling creatively about being able to weave so much real music industry and real life in general into the fictional fabric of this series over the decade plus that you've written it?
Well, I was going out all the time during this era, and there was all these big black guys at the door. There's all these big, guards, security guards at these doors. And then I also began seeing, some of these guys bodyguarding their, artists. And they were always very cordial. And I was like, these guys are interesting. What do they see? What world do they see? And that's what a picture of Britney Spears. And she had like a really huge black guy, I guess, as her bodyguard. And I was like, who's that guy? What does he see? What's his life like? And then I'd seen the Bodyguard with Costner and Whitney Houston. I said, well, maybe what if I wrote a book that was the opposite of that? That the Bodyguard was one of these big black guys, and that the singer was in fact a Britney Spears type singer. So I created a character called Bridget Hayes, who basically was Britney Spears. And so it was a chance to really look at that world and look at these. So yeah, I was very intrigued by the Bodyguard guys. And it used to be a legendary guy in New York named Big George. Big George was, I would say he's probably 6'6", 6'7", always wore a suit. But he was like the bodyguard for Broadway stars. He was, in fact, one point I know in Rolling Stone magazine, he made the list of the most 100 most influential people in the record business. He did Jagger when Jagger came to New York. He was that guy. And he had glasses and he was very distinguished, but he also was very formidable. So I was always fascinated by those characters and what they saw, what they told, and what they didn't tell. I think that they were some of the most fun experiences I've had. Just being able to use all of this stuff. I mean, I always felt like each book was tied to, I tried to tie them to a musical genre, probably against hip hop, the Funk and Die in LA, the Lost Treasures of R&B. So, because all of these cultures have a lore to them. There's a mystique. There's a series of stories, characters, gestures that are integral to them. And so that was fun. Also, to be liberated a bit from the facts was really fun. So yeah, that's a great run that I had a lot of fun with that. I'm not in the frame of mind right now to do another one. I actually have I don't know if you know this book, The Perfect Crime. It's a series of crime stories from around the world, and it just came out. It's an anthology, and so I have a story in here called "The 10 Lessons of Big Matt Silver," which is kind of dark noir set in the world of hip hop, and I'm thinking maybe trying to expand that into a novel.
Returning to the world of nonfiction, career-long fan of the Washington Post would admire within the pages of Hip Hop America that, as in his previous works in nonfiction, George's voice is assured, accessible, and knowledgeable, crowning you in their review as the most accomplished critic of African-American music of his generation, and as your new book chronicles the mainstreaming of hip-hop music and culture, and the dramatic effect it had on post-civil rights American culture. It offers a solid examination of Black youth culture's continued influence on American society, and that if this vigor continues to be hip-hop's stimulus, the genre will continue to provide. What made you feel like it was time to roll your sleeves up and begin writing what the Post argued in the end is a logical corollary to the death of rhythm and blues?
So I started doing, I think CB4 came out in 93, March 93. I'd done that, and I was still writing for The Voice a little bit, and not regularly anymore. And I started working on Hip Hop America maybe in 94, and then I sort of felt like, well, maybe I'm too old now to write about hip hop. I was having I was already having these feelings like the thing has moved on and I'm not involved in it on a day-to-day basis like I used to be. And then Biggie and Tupac are both shot. And I thought, wow, we're moving into some new phase with the culture. I didn't know where it was going, but definitely those as they reflected, they reflect some kind of turning point. And I said, well, I got to finish the book. It's time to finish this narrative. And so that really propelled me to finish it. Their passing got me over the finish line. I think the book came out almost 10 years after Death Rhythm and Blues, which is interesting too. And it was interesting because I was thinking, this hip hop book, this is not it's kind of a sequel to the Death Rhythm and Blues, but it's also its own thing because the trajectory of the culture is still going upward. That's why I call it Hip Hop America, in the sense that there's America that's a hip hop place now. And I think it had just really gotten to me to be super pop in the mid 90s. And then it went on to, literally during the time that book is published, there's Jay-Z begins his rise, 50 Cent begins his rise, Lil Wayne, the South is already, there's a ton of stuff going on. And I was just trying to capture that, my last sort of being a semi-contemporary to the culture.
You continue to crank out more fascinating studies on musical history throughout the 2000s with highlights like The Hippest Trip in America, Soul Train and the Evolution of Culture and Style, which the New York Times Book Review declared to be the definitive book on Soul Train. Post-Soul Nation, the explosive, contradictory, triumphant, and tragic 1980s as experienced by African Americans, where the American Library Association promised that this work will draw an audience interested in the undertones and backstories of American popular culture, and a book you co-wrote with tour manager Alan Leeds, The James Brown Reader, 50 Years of Writing About the Godfather of Soul, in which the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame raved that you two had assembled the first comprehensive collection of writings about the late great Godfather of Soul, creating a fascinating mosaic of the man and the musician. How exciting was that history to record for fans to read? Especially writing on that James Brown project with someone like Alan Leeds, who'd been there with him firsthand through all of it.
I met Alan through a woman who was my publicist way back in the Michael Jackson days, actually. And she was good friends with him. When I met him, he was working for Prince. And, Prince and I had a somewhat complicated relationship. I'm one of the first people to interview him when he came to New York in '81. And we got along really well. He was an odd guy, to say the least. But I went to his first show at the first New York show was at the Bottom Line. I went there with a bunch of my friends from college. Was knocked out by his skill. It was just amazing. And then I wrote about him a lot from various publications. I covered him in Billboard. I wrote some other things. And then, if you listen to his second album, album number one, the fourth album, Against 1999, I think, is a controversy in 1999.
Controversy.
So one of them has a song called All the Critics Love You in New York. And now I'm pretty sure he was referencing myself. And I mean, me and Barry Michael Cooper always talk about that because we both met him during that run. So that was like a little sardonic. We can't tell if it's a diss or not. It's a weird thing. You can't tell. Is he making fun of us? Does he like us? And then I gave opening night of Purple Rain tour a bad review in Billboard. And I think he didn't like that too much. And then years later, he did a song called Bob George, which apparently is half a diss of me. It's a weird thing, yeah, to think that that review had any impact on him at all. And that's the only thing I could think of that would have triggered that diss, because otherwise our interactions were pretty cordial over the years. I have a bunch of other Prince stories, but that's like a whole nother thing. But so I say that I got totally lost talking about.
Well, you met Alan Leeds through this.
Right. So all of this, I meet Alan. And, he really, his James Brown stuff, knowledge is insane. So he starts talking. At some point after Brown died, I really, someone needs to really, there's so much great writing about him. There needs to be some place where this writing lives. And it can, maybe not to sell a ton of books now, but for part of history, for anybody who wants to know about Brown, they can go to this book and there's a real sampling of his entire journey. And Alan had collected so much stuff. Alan's basement in Minneapolis, he's got this thing, he's got every James Brown 45. I mean, it goes, it's insane. So I found a bunch of stuff, and then Alan had tons of stuff. And I just kind of shaped some stuff I edited so it would be repetitive. But it was so much fun. I mean, that's one of my favorite experiences, because you get to watch how someone is being written about, a major artist, before anybody knows they're a major artist, to when they're kind of blowing up, to when they become an institution, to when they become kind of, if not over, but, less respected. And then suddenly hip hop happened and they have this whole renewed, period of respect. So it was amazing. And to watch him go from articles in Black newspapers, from the 1960s, James Brown's coming to town, all the way to major profiles in the New Yorker and Rolling Stone. It's such an interesting, it was a great, great fun, illuminating, because you saw how Brown evolved through how the coverage of him evolved. That was one of my favorite books.
As you translated your storytelling gifts from medium to medium, you broaden your palette within the film world from fiction and nonfiction documentaries in recent years, featuring an extremely impressive portfolio including Finding the Funk and Good Hair with Chris Rock, the hit Netflix series The Get Down, and upcoming documentaries A Great Day in Hip Hop Revisited and Dear Mama, a Tupac documentary airing on FX, and a documentary on the 30th anniversary of Michael Jackson's Thriller, among others. For viewers who might not have an appreciation for it, how does the process work writing and creating a documentary versus, say, a book?
So but I've been, here's what happened, as you know, is I've been so busy, I got really involved in doing documentaries. And that's taken up so much time. It's been great, but it's taken up a lot of time. You know, as I've gotten older and been more involved in documentaries have taken the space that writing the nonfiction books did for me. And I think that what's interesting about them, it takes the same kind of research. You still have to go out and find people. It does save you a little bit. It saves you definitely. You're not sitting your ass alone in a room. You're actually out in the world, which is great. So I find them to be. It's a good way. I mean, in the current climate where the kind of books I used to do are not as publishers are not as interested in those books anymore. That being able to try and do this with visuals, I think, is really great. I'm trying to I have a number of music related docs. I'm now hopefully going to get these going because I've only actually done one total music doc, which was the Finding the Funk, and I'd love to do some more, and so I'm hoping that'll happen. The big challenge to doing music is the music itself and clearing the music. I don't know if I told you this, but I did the doc on the 40th anniversary of Thriller. It's called Thriller 40. That was a great revisit. It's like full circle. I went back and interviewed Greg Fillinganes again and the Waters and all those wonderful musicians. I also interviewed John Landis and some of those people. So in many ways, doing the doc has been a chance to revisit the beginnings of my career, so that's a very full circle. I think one of the things that in this era, information that people can trust is super valuable, and I think that's what I'm trying to do with the documentaries, to give people stuff they didn't know, but also do it in a way that's not exploitive and that is not undermining people, but trying to be educational. If you watch, Finding the Funk is available on Amazon. You could rent it or purchase it there. But we had to take out almost all of the songs. I mean, we had to use sort of canned music to cover some of the holes because there's no way in hell. We did it for VH1 and they licensed the music for X amount of years. But once those licenses are over, there's no way in the world I could have two Ohio Player songs and a Rick James song and P-Funk and Urban. It's just, there's no way. That's probably, so and that's the biggest challenge. So what happens with music docs, it's very hard to do a deaf rhythm and blues type music doc. Because if you're going to be somewhat critical or less laudatory about, people necessarily don't want to be part of it. And so you're stuck because you may need a certain song to make a certain point. So I think that's one of the challenges of the music documentary model, is that there's not as much room because all the rights holders involved to be as insightful as you'd like to be.
Time Out New York hailed your memoir, City Kid, a writer's memoir of ghetto life and post-soul success, as a front row seat to New York's shifting dynamics, while Bookpage raved that in the direct and passionate writing style, George recounts what it was like to be young, black, poor, and driven. City Kid puts the reader at a pulsating false line of the seismic shakeup of black movies and music in the 1980s and 90s. What do you feel was key to your success in navigating the roller coaster ride that's surviving writing in a business like this for as many decades as you chronicle in the book?
I don't know. I think one thing that I would say that's been very clear, and that's from my career and all the people that I've interviewed or been friends with and seen, is that there's always a transitional points in everyone's career, and the longer the career is, the probably more you stack up. And I would say that almost every career has there's an economic downturn. when I left Billboard to go into film in '89, people were thinking about, well, I got Strictly Business made in '91 and CB4, but '90 and '91 were rough. And then when I sort of made a transition into this period where I started really was kind of with good hair, I guess you might say. I started making a transition into doing more documentaries, but that took a while to figure out how to make that work. And it was definitely a couple of fallow years. I think those fallow years are just part of I don't think there's any way to avoid having, the biggest stars we know, we've written about a bunch of, there's definitely like a couple of years where they fall off the cliff, whether because they're burnt out, mentally, personally, or even financially. So I think the only thing I can say is patience. And I guess my general thought is there is an application for your knowledge and talents. If you've established your place in the world in a certain way, you may just have to look at how you take that information and knowledge and apply it. That's been sort of the documentary transition has been like, oh, this is like doing my books. So I just have to take all that knowledge, but also with the benefits of film is that there's a lot of work I don't have to do. Interviewing people is interviewing people. Once you learn how to do that, you can take that anywhere. Researching how to find a point of view. Those are things So that's what to me, the transition from doing nonfiction to doing the docs, that's been taking that skill set, but figuring out a way in which it works in a different world. And I think that's the challenge, but all of this new technology, whether it's TikTok or I do a Substack now. And it's been fun. And first I was like, no one's going to read this thing. How do I get people to know about it? But I built up a little bit of an audience. It's been it's not writing for the Village Voice anymore, but that doesn't even exist. So this is where if I want to do that kind of short nonfiction writing, this is the space for it. And just understand the economics of it and the work you have to put in to promote it. But I think it's always, I don't think that the knowledge or the expertise, it's just a matter of how can I apply this expertise in another box? Listen, the world that I came up in doesn't exist anymore.
Do you envision a return to noveling anytime in the near future?
Only now do I have a little bit of a window. I'm contemplating what I can sit down and write again at length,
What else do you have coming up on your creative horizons?
I did my own personal collection, the Nelson George mixtape, and that's through an independent publisher called Pacific Books here in New York, Pacific Books in Brooklyn. And that's been fun to really take control of the means of production. And then also I've been using my Vimeo. I have Urban Romances is my name there. And I'm starting to put up a lot of my older content that has sort of fallen out. So Brooklyn Boheme, which is a documentary I did in 2011, is now up and available for rent or purchase on there. And it's a great record of Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s. Vernon Reid, Spike Lee, who else is in it? Jesus, Rosie Perez. God, I'm going a blank. It's just this real snapshot of that community of people I ended up moving into in the 80s and 90s. And then I have another thing coming up, which I think you'll enjoy. It's called Smart Black People. And it was a film I made in 2005. It's tied into the release of Post-Soul Nation. I never really put it out for sale before. And it's two dialogues about the 80s. Kumo D, Marcus Miller, Reggie Warrington Hudlin, Barry Michael Cooper, Greg Tate, Russell Simmons, Bill Steffley, and myself, and also Linnell George, the writer from LA, Michelle Wallace, the author. And it's just a really interesting look back at 81 to 89 as this transition. So it's very much a companion to Post-Soul Nation. And that'll be up should be up by the weekend. So one of my goals is to take a lot of my literary work with the Nelson George mixtape and take the visual work that's sort of out of print and both give them a new life. Right now, I'm just sort of in a, I'm sort of trying to figure out what the next thing is. I worked a lot last year. I did a Willie Mays doc for HBO. So I'm kind of like just getting, I was really tired, dude. So I'm just kind of getting my mojo back and trying to figure out what it is. I've been starting to write another book, but that book is it's a nonfiction book. It's about it's actually it's kind of a COVID book. It was my father died in COVID during the pandemic, and I had a lot of friends who died. 9 guys who died between 2019 and 2021. So I'm writing a book about mortality and dealing with death and close friends, mentors, and so that's like and hopefully to be out next year. But that's taken up a lot of time because it's probably the most difficult book I've ever written because it's the most personal and dealing with what people gave you, and trying to honor their lives. It's a heavy. I have 9 different people. It's a lot. So I'm working on that.
We'd love to close with some words of wisdom for the aspiring author or writer on the rise, along with the golden rule that there's no such thing as writer's block. What have you found to be any other key foundational ABCs to building a lasting career in the business of making a living with words?
And what you just said there, that's absolutely. There's no such thing as writer's block. It's if you're stuck on something, move on to the next. Keep going. Number one thing is write every day. I got a little notebook here. I keep it with me all the time. Take it to the gym. I never know when something's going to come up. An idea, a title. So I think building consistency and basically building a muscle on to be able to do. And I think that's number one because I think the thing that separates writers from non-writers is consistency. Everyone has an idea for a book, they say. Everyone has, but are you going to put the work in? Years ago, I interviewed Quincy Jones, and he said to me, the difference that separated Michael Jackson from a lot of other singers, what he called ass power. And he's not talking about Michael Jackson's dancing. He's talking about Michael Jackson's willingness to put the time in to be great. And when Michael was recording, before he went to the session, he went to his vocal coach, and he did an hour of vocal exercises to open it up. He didn't just walk in cold off the street. Michael would exacting in terms of his harmonies and making sure that he took the time to make sure all the harmonies were stacked properly. That's us. We gotta put the time in. We have to be disciplined. And we have to understand that it's a process and that patience, almost nothing good comes out of rushing. You can have a hit record with a crazy thing you did in one afternoon. Yeah, there's no crazy things you did in one afternoon. There's no equivalent of that in books. You just got to put the time in. So I think patience and being patient with yourself. Being patient with yourself, because I think we all can have a tendency to go, damn, I should be through with this, or damn, we should be farther along. It's not how it works. You're building a house every day.
Nelson George, you have entertained and educated us with your writing for years. Thank you so much for taking out time today to be on About the Authors TV.